Illicit activity like illegal mining is widespread and extremely lucrative throughout Latin America. As we just saw in Jerry Haddon's documentary, those big profits do not trickle down to workers like miners. Other activities like drug cultivation and distribution in Mexico account for tens of billions of dollars each year. But how much does the underground economy really affect the region? Joining me now to discuss this is our political analyst, Laura Carlson. Laura, welcome. What are the biggest illegal operations we are currently seeing at work in Latin America?
The top three are clearly drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and human trafficking. And they lead by quite a ways over illegal mining and illegal logging. In Latin America, drug trafficking is by far the largest. We have cocaine clearly coming out of the Andean region, going mostly to the U.S. market, but now it's going to the European market as well. We also have heroin and methamphetamines coming out of Mexico, particularly lately, and marijuana from a number of the countries. This generates huge profits for criminals throughout the region, and it's what, of course, has created these very powerful drug cartels in many of our countries. Human trafficking is a major industry that's grown tremendously in the last years, and it's largely controlled by the same drug cartels that do the illicit drug trafficking. There, the human trafficking is focused on sex trafficking, often with very young girls and children, as well as organ trafficking, a particularly horrifying business. What we've seen there is that this has grown with the drug cartels, and it now is prevalent in countries throughout the region. And then arms trafficking is something that isn't discussed quite as often. But for example, in Colombia and Mexico, there were more illegal arms confiscated than in Iraq. It's a very serious and a very lucrative problem that we're also seeing in Central America and other countries as well. Most of the arms are being traced back to the United States. In Guatemala, for example, there's a large number that are coming from Israel. But this is, again, another industry that's forming part of the underground economy. Illegal logging is also very prevalent, and these have a particularly harsh impact on the communities and on the natural resources of the countries involved.
So how much income do they earn?
We don't have the numbers. There's no regulation. There's no way to really track the flows that are going back and forth as a result of these illegal activities. There are some studies, the United Nations and others try to quantify what's happening here, because it's very important to know it has a severe impact on national development and on any kind of economic projections that a nation might make. In Latin America, a few years back, they calculated about $320 billion for the drug trade. There's also calculations that human trafficking is bringing in about $6.6 billion. On the drug trade, it's important to say that that's the retail market. And what actually stays in Latin America, because we have to remember that these are transnational businesses. They're not regional, they're linking the world in these transnational illicit flows. And so what stays in Latin America is really only about half. Here in Mexico, they talk about the drug trade bringing into the cartels, to the criminal organizations, about $20 to $40 billion a year. And that's a really big spread, which gives you an idea of how difficult it is to calculate.
Incredible numbers. Laura, what impact do these illegal enterprises have on the government and society?
They pose a tremendous challenge. First of all, you have all this money going out of the country that is not regulated and it's not taxed. So you have a very severe loss of revenues in that sense. Also, many of these activities, particularly mining and logging, obviously, deplete natural resources that are practically just stolen from the country. So again, you've got a major loss of revenues in the rapid depletion and exploitation of natural resources, as well as the contamination that affects the water supplies and that affects the communities. The other impact has to do with the conflict that's caused. When criminal organizations have to defend criminal activities, they enter into conflicts of competition between each other. They enter into conflict clearly with state security forces that are attempting to control and cut off these activities. And this conflict even is caused on the local level when indigenous communities and others attempt to defend their own communities and natural resources from criminal organizations that are coming in to do the mining and to do the logging. The conflict ends up in deaths. It destabilizes countries. We've seen what's happened in terms of governance in countries like Colombia and Mexico trying to control these illegal activities. So the impact on the state, the impact on society is being felt more and more strongly every year here within Latin America as these industries regrettably are growing rather than decreasing.
How much is illegal activity responsible for damaged resources? In Brazil, for example, there have been massive deforestation as a result of illegal logging and mining.
This is another area that people are becoming more and more aware of the serious impact of illegal activities. In Brazil, they talked about 50,000 hectares lost, a lot of it precious rainforest to illegal mining. Here in Mexico, they talk about 500,000 hectares a year from illegal logging. That's a huge amount, and although it's a renewable resource, it takes years, and the deforestation leads to erosion. Much of that land will never be reclaimed. It's impossible to reclaim it. We also have a severe impact on the water supply. Not only does illegal mining, any kind of mining actually, take up a tremendous amount of water, but it also pollutes. We saw the use of mercury, a poison. There's also the use of arsenic and other poisons in the processes. So even the water that remains after these illegal activities have been carried out in a region is oftentimes contaminated and unusable. Societies are just beginning to have a way to sort of even dimension the activities and the impact on the ecology in the long term, and to begin to realize that it's really necessary to have some laws and some regulations that begin to control this.
Laura, the recent recapture of Mexican drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman shed light on the issue of money laundering and its connection with drug trafficking. Just how prevalent is money laundering in Latin America, and what kind of impact does it have on a government?
Again, those figures are very difficult to get. There's now many more laws in place in the United States, and they're trying to bring all the laws throughout Latin America kind of up to par in terms of controlling money laundering, anti-money laundering units and investigations. However, it's just a fraction of what's needed. We know that there's billions and billions of dollars that are laundered, in much of it from the drug trade, but from all sorts of activities, including corruption, kickbacks, extortion, a lot of invisible activities within the economy that you don't see, that we're not able to measure, and that they come back and then they form part of the so-called legal economy. For example, with the recapture of El Chapo Guzman, probably the largest drug lord in Latin America and the head of the Sinaloa cartel, there's an opportunity to really unravel this financial empire of illicit flows that was created over the time that he was the leader of this organization, with the information that presumably both governments will now have. Because El Chapo Guzman was in prison before, and oddly enough, his financial empire, the assets, the illegal businesses, were scarcely touched. And there's a reason for that. A lot of these illicit flows are going through legal organizations, powerful financial organizations, such as banks and businesses that are established in other countries, and their interest in keeping those flows moving. There are people who say that it's the illicit flows that held up the international financial system in the 2008 crisis. So we're coming up against some political resistance to actually making the changes that have to be made.
Laura Carlson in Mexico City, thank you for your insight.